Okay. Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mai haramai, te whare waranga Waikato Kirikiriroa Aotearoa, ko i Waitaha. So welcome everybody to the University of Waikato in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our second Australasian Cities Research Network Speaking Out seminar. My name's Ian White and I'll be chairing this session with Dr. Ash Alam. If you click on the in the chat box, there's an Eventbrite link to some of the readings, and you'll see a list of publications from Hannah, which will form the basis of the discussion. And I'd encourage you to have a read and reflect on those, both as we go on afterwards too. And if you do have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat function, and we'll try and manage those at the end. I should also let you know that the session's being recorded and we'll upload the video to the ACRN YouTube page. I'd like to now hand over to Whetau Taukamo, who has generously offered to provide a mihi whakatau, a welcome acknowledgement. So kia ora whetau.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Te mihi tuatahi ki tā tātine atua. Mauri ore ki a tātou katoa. Hiri nō ki ngā mati a haere atura ke muri e te arai o tāne nui ārangi. Haere atura, moi maira. Ki te kingi Māori ko kingi tūheite, e noho ane i rungi tā hurua tapu tono, mātua tūpuna rire hu, pai mārire ki oi. Hiri nō ki te kāhui ariki, tēnā koutou, pai mārire. Hiri nō ki te hungora tēnā koutou ngā iwi katoa, I ngā whenua katoa. E mihi mai o haa ki o koutou, I roti I tēnei kaupapa I te ahi nei. Ka nui te mihi kia te aitanga māhaki, kia Ngāti Porau, Ngāti Tipa, Waikato Tainui, hiri nō ki te moana nui āki wa tēnā koutou nā kai kōrero I roti I tēnei kaupapa I tēnei ahi hei. Kia ora and welcome everyone to this conference. My name's Whetau and I'll just provide a short English translation of what is said in Te Reo Māori, just acknowledging the great creator and also those who have passed on to the eternal world whom we remember and who passed things on to us. Acknowledge the Māori King because here in the University of Waikato, our campus sits in and under his protection. Also acknowledge greatly those who are going to speak to us and who've prepared to talk about this kaupapa, which is the Aotearoa Indigenous Voices, and especially to our co-chairs, Ash and to Ian. And also just to kick us off today, I'll provide us with a karakia, like a prayer or incantation. A whakataka te hau ki turu, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina ki tuki a mā tara ki tai. Kia hia kia no te atukura he tio, he huka, he hauhunga, ti hei mauri ora. Peace and blessings be upon us all. For the cool wind from the east, or from the south and also from the west. May everything go forward in peace and harmony. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora whetau. The session today is entitled Aotearoa Indigenous Voices, Data Research and Policy. And we're going to hear from three fantastic researchers from different disciplines who are all positioned at the interface of Indigenous research and practice in Aotearoa and who are all shaping national and international debates. The panelists will each provide an overview of their research on the role of Indigenous and Pacific knowledge and their expertise in policymaking and science, as well as the impacts of structural racism in the university sector. This will be followed by a Q&A to explore the interconnected themes in the panelists' work. So now I'll hand over to my co-chair, Ash Alam, to introduce our first korero, our first discussion.
Thanks, Ian. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Ash Alam. I'm a committee member at the Australasian Cities Research Network, ACRN, and I'm joining you from the University of Otago, New Zealand. So I'm delighted to announce our first panelist, Dr. Tara McAllister. So Tara is a research fellow at Te Pūnaha Matatini and the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Auckland. Tara has expertise in water resource management and research surrounding the challenges the Maori are facing in the higher education sector. Tara is also the lead author of the provoking paper, Why Isn't My Professor Maori? A snapshot of the academic workforce in New Zealand universities. So thank you for joining us, Tara. Could you please start by briefly introducing yourself and your kaupapa for our audience in next 2-3 minutes? Over to you, Tara.
Thank you, Ash. Kia ora koutou, ko maunga haumi tōku maunga, ko waipawa tōku awa, ko horauta tōku waka, ko te aitanga māhaki, me Ngāti Porou, ōku iwi, ko te whānau taupara tōku hapū, ko takipu tōku marae, ko Tara McAllister hau. So kia ora everyone, I introduce myself with my pepeha, and my pepeha places me within the world. It connects me to Papa Tuanuku, or Mother Earth. It connects me to my ancestors, my mokopuna, my grandchildren, and my people. My pepeha is an anchor that grounds me to specific locations like my ancestral mountains and awa, and connects me to others through shared whakapapa or genealogy. So as I said, my name's Tara. I'm a Māori woman. My pronouns are she, her, and ia. I hail from the tribes of Te Aitanga, Māhaki, and Ngāti Porou. I'm a mother of 2 boys, and I'm also a researcher. So I completed my PhD in 2018 in freshwater ecology at the University of Canterbury. And shortly after that, I began my first postdoc at Te Pūnaha Matatini, a Centre of Research Excellence run out of Auckland University. I had my first child about 3 months after starting my postdoc, and then another one last year. And the kind of direction of my scholarship has really changed and been shaped by my experiences as a Māori woman in higher education, and through these experiences I've been able to connect with people like Dr. Siriana Naipi and Professor Joanna Kidman and Dr. Rere Moana Theodore, in a whole pile of Indigenous women who really motivate me and inspire me to change universities so that they're better places for future generations. Kia ora everyone.
Thanks so much, Tara. And we'll hear more about the research in a while. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Siriana Naipi. Siriana's research explores how universities and research spaces can embrace and esteem knowledge and serve inclusiveness. Siriana is the author of Why Isn't My Professor Pacifica? So we are really keen to know about these interesting papers in a while. So along with Tara and other researchers, Siriana is also the author on the paper Glass Ceilings in New Zealand Universities. So before we go to the discussion on these papers, Siriana, I would like you to introduce and start by briefly introducing yourself and your kaupapa for the next 2-3 minutes, please.
Nisan Bolavanaka, my name is Siriana Naipi. I carry my great-grandmother's name, who raised my mother in the village of Nikinda in Neta City, Nigananidolo. My last name is that of my husband's. So he is from Avasali in Tamakatonga in Niue. Him and I are both first-generation New Zealand-born Pacific. I have a Pākehā father as well, which has its own interesting history in terms of our family and migrating here. But I think it's really important that we're having conversations about Indigenous knowledges here to acknowledge that I'm Pacific on someone else's whenua. So my Indigenous knowledges that I bring is ancestral Indigenous knowledge, and that my lived experience as a Fijian differs to that who are learning the lessons from the Waimarara River versus I learnt mine in Mount Wellington. So they're slightly different. I study critical university studies, and by some miracle, Joanna Kidman was in a lecture that I was giving about how angry I was about Pacific women's experiences with New Zealand universities, and she connected Tara and myself. And since then, we've had children together, we've written papers together, we've had newborn babies over a pandemic, and we've faced job interviews, and we've faced media interviews, and we've done quite a lot together, and I'm forever grateful that the ancestors or the universe or whoever is responsible brought us together, because it makes taking on these institutions that much easier. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara and Siriana, for such an intimate interaction. So now in our first korero, or discussion point, for the next 10 minutes or so, we will focus on two key questions to know more about your recent work in the university sector. So we want to start with the 2020 paper titled Underrepresented and Overlooked Maori and Pacifica Scientists in New Zealand's Universities and Crown Research Institutes. So in this article, you and colleagues looked into Maori and Pacifica recruitment in the higher education sector and the workforce between 2008 and 2018. There are some startling facts revealed. For example, one university had not a single Maori and Pacifica recruitment in their science department in those 11 years. So this is deeply, I would say, disturbing but revealing data on the face of the public funded education sector and workforce. So could you please tell us what led you to this research, and if you want to reflect on how some institutions got to this harrowing situation, please.
Yes, I can start. So, you know, as someone who has a PhD in freshwater ecology, and also someone who went through their entire tertiary education without having a Māori lecturer for any of my science papers, this paper, which was a progression after our Why Isn't My Professor Māori papers, was a kind of really natural place to go. And the data collected as part of this paper was collected during an internship with the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, as well as MBIE, so the Ministry of Business Innovation. Not sure what the E stands for. What does the E stand for, Siriana? Can't remember.
I think people that make money.
Employment.
Yes, so employment, of course. Thanks to who. Yeah, so having other people help acquiring the data was really essential, because, you know, if you get an email, or a university gets an email from a ministry department or the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor, someone who holds significant power, they're much more likely to respond than like a random postdoc like myself. So they were really key in acquiring that data. And the data itself was really confronting. It showed that over a period of 11 years, the universities and CRIs employed about 0 to, I think the most was 7.5% of all the people employed in science departments were either Māori or Pacific. So, you know, it was very revealing that universities and also our Crown research institutes were not and are not doing enough to build a really sustainable Māori and Pacific science workforce. And yeah, as you mentioned, there was one university that had never employed a Māori or Pacific scientist in their science department over a period of 11 years. And I think, you know, that's just not good enough in this day and age. And I hope that they have since taken steps to increase that really pitiful number. I guess the other really important thing looking at those numbers was that in many cases there was no change over the 11-year period that we had data for. So again, that makes us question the kind of outward espousals of valuing diversity and valuing te tiriti when there are no Māori or Pacific people in these spaces. Yeah, I might hand it over to Siriana there.
Thank you, Tara. Tara, I want to be really clear that Tara is the person who gets all of the data. So her work in analyzing the data and doing all those, I'm a qualitative researcher by trade. I've had to learn how to read graphs, and there are still some charts in our research papers that I'm like, sure. But what happens when you work across disciplines is that I'm able to bring my critical university studies lens and be like, oh yeah, people have talked about this and here's some ways we can think about it. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel because we're working across disciplines. And these papers come about fundamentally because Tara and I and our co-authors just are sick of it. We are sick of our institutions excluding and underserving Māori and Pacific communities. This is not data that they did not have, right? So this is all, it's publicly available data, or it's data that the institutions already had. And this is, I think, why data sovereignty in this case is quite important, because they're collecting it and doing nothing with it. Our papers didn't tell us anything we didn't know. They just put it out in the public and said, this data's sitting here, let's talk about it. And fundamentally, we choose the papers to drive for change. So the Why Isn't My Professor collective, the Māori and Pacific papers, those were about making sure that no other scientist has to go through a science degree and not have a Māori or Pacific professor. It's about changing how it's about naming it so we can change it, because until we name it, even if it's unhelpful to say racism, it's not going to change. And these are the sorts of conversations I think that we're hoping our data can drive, are the conversations that we've been having in the qualitative space. It's just that, unfortunately, with stories, people kind of go, oh, that's so sad, and move on, those in power. Whereas when we have the data and we have the numbers, it's a lot harder for them to say we misinterpreted, we didn't quite understand, or maybe that was your one-off experience. No, Tara is not the only Māori student to go through a degree without seeing a single Māori academic. And so I think that these are the sorts of conversations we hope to drive with these papers. And we really want people, we love it when people tell us they like slammed our paper down at an HR meeting and said, why aren't we hiring Māori or Pacific? And if your answer is there are none, and it's your discipline, the only person who's at fault there is you. You create Māori and Pacific academics in your area. So why have you got no PhDs? Why have you got no postdocs? Why is there no one ready to step into your discipline? And that's my rant.
Thanks, Sarah and Siriana. I mean, as an extension, because you talked about sickness and precarity and exclusion. So as an extension of this first question, I would like to also highlight, in somewhere in your papers, you quoted that people who are included, for example, you quoted that science faculties within the universities are generally not safe and inclusive environments for Māori and Pacific students. So, I mean, it's quite a strong claim, but what you are saying now, it relates. And could you please tell us about the nature of precarity we're talking about here?
I think we've got a paper. We're just trying to find some time. I mean, overall, I think we know precarity is increasing. I'm involved in the Early Career Researchers Forum at Te Aparangi, and we had a gathering of 300 early career researchers from across Aotearoa. Very few of us have full-time permanent jobs. I'm one of the lucky few. We're seeing temporary postdocs put out there. There's quite a lot of things contributing to that. And one of the things we've done is we've done an ethnic breakdown that we're hoping we can get out soon. I don't want to give too much away. We like it when people are excited for our papers, but we're also very aware of the urgency of getting these papers out. And one of the reasons we choose to publish in open access journals and Indigenous journals is that we want our communities to be able to access them and have those conversations, and hopefully also read the whole journal. There's like some really cool stuff next to our journals. Tara, did you want to add to the precarity piece?
I think one thing I wanted to respond to was the comment around how science faculties are really unsafe spaces, by saying this book is really awesome and it's only $60, and it talks in depth about the experiences of lots of our awesome Māori scientists, tahus in it, and kind of outlines why those spaces aren't particularly safe. And also in more forthcoming research, which is led by myself, Siriana, and Dr. Leilani Walker, we've done a big survey of 50 Māori and Pacific early career researchers in STEM, and it's all about how we experience tertiary education. And so there's some really powerful and absolutely heartbreaking stories in that. So that's something that we're also working on getting out into the public arena.
there is so Pacific early career researchers are writing qualitative stories about our experiences in the institution as well. So I do think if you look for it, the stories are there. The stories behind the data are there. And I tend to be quite upfront about it. It's a universities were built foundationally on racist values. Hopefully they've shifted over time, but we're still seeing the ramification of what happens when you build a university with land that was gifted to you, that was stolen from the crown stole, sorry. What happens? We're still seeing what happens when you have a science system that was based around the idea of race science and using Polynesians were the missing link. How can we explain these brown people who are clearly civilized? All of these that's why the history of science is so important in understanding how Māori and Pacific experience our academy, because our academy was built on certain values, and those values haven't shifted that far, really. You only need to sit in university meetings that discuss things like the PBRF review, that discuss freedom of speech on campus, to kind of just see how good we are at hiding publicly how we truly feel. Yeah.
Thanks to both of you. So because we got to this situation, so I'm now moving to the second question. So if you want to find a solution, but there is an interesting quote from your paper, that 2020 paper, that here I quote, the solutions for addressing the underrepresentation of Maori and Pacifica scientists do not simply lie in getting more people through a fundamentally broken system, but require the removal of systematic barriers that prevent Maori and Pacifica from progressing further in science and ultimately pursuing careers in science. So, I mean, it nicely captures the systematic barriers that exist in institutions. And I would like to ask each of you what we need to happen for institutions and individuals to eliminate the systematic barriers, and what are your thoughts? I'm aware of the time, but we still perhaps can reflect on this for the next 5 minutes.
I guess it is about confronting those different institutional habits that exclude people. So in terms of the one thing, it's kind of take a critical one thing, listen to Māori and Pacific academics, researchers and students. We're not lying. And when we say something is slowing down our progress, it's slowing down our progress. And it can be as small as that graduate student in your DA who's saying, I feel a little bit lonely. Why do they feel lonely? Look around your DA, to something as big as why, when we're doing a cluster hire, can we not find any Māori and Pacific in our space? And why can't we just say we're looking for Māori and Pacific expertise? I've got a PhD in education. I teach in sociology. If you're Māori or Pacific and you're in the academy, you care about the problem. And so one of the things we do is we apply whatever lenses, whatever we can get our hands on. We're transdisciplinary in the way we think about knowledge. And I think that that's sort of the one thing is actually listen to us. It shouldn't take 2 early career researchers to write a paper using data the institution already had for change. But that's what it's taking. And so let's shift that and learn from that and just listen when Māori and Pacific say we've got a problem.
I kind of think there are several really easy things that we can do now. That increasing PhD scholarships, those are just pitiful. Reducing the overheads for Māori and Pacific postdocs. We know that there's a massive bottleneck in, I don't want to say the pipeline because we don't like pipeline, but along our journeys at that post-PhD stage. So we really need universities to actually start providing post-PhD pathways. And one of the changes that I'd really like to see in my lifetime is a change in leadership. So when we look at who's leading our universities, they're often white, older men, and I'd love to see a real shift towards co-governance with Māori. So for every Māori, for every Pākehā or Tauiwi Vice Chancellor, let's have a Māori one. For every Pākehā or Tauiwi HOD, let's have a Māori one, and let's see how those changes in leadership have ramifications all throughout our research sector. And another thing I think would help is if we shift our idea of excellence and impact. So throughout our research sector, we're often hearing about these two words, and I really think that those two things, for me as a Māori researcher, what I think is excellent and impactful is significantly different than what universities might think is excellent and impactful. So yeah, those are some of the kind of initial, just little changes I'd like to see.
and that shift in impact and excellence is outlined in the PBRF. So tell your institutions you support the PBRF changes, because if you read Senate notes from certain institutions, they are aware that if these changes go through, they face losing money, they face losing resources. So engage in that process and say, actually, we really support this change. If your institution, quite a few institutions are going through changing promotion processes and they're doing it kind of quietly, email the person who's responsible for that and say, I'd like to engage with this. And I do think we should change how we measure excellence and impact. And how is it that people who are the public face of things or who are engaging constantly with community are seen as unimpactful academics when it's those sorts of things. It's that public engagement within the university that's really important. The thing that we don't have time for, which I think Graham Hingero Smith said, you know, they keep us busy on purpose. So ignore the things that they're trying to keep us busy with and engage in the system that enables us to change how they see us and understand us.
Thanks, Tara and Siriana. I think on this note, Tahu should engage in this conversation, perhaps. Tahu, do you want to add something here? And we can slowly transition to a second corridor.
Oh, that's so staged. I don't know if I had much to add, you know, and the reason when Ian reached out and said, would you like to come on a panel? I said, I'm quite happy to follow Tara and Siriana because this is where things are at. You know, what they're saying and their unrelenting focus on institutional injustice is really what the system needs. And like Siriana said, that it would take 2 early career researchers and their team to, in some cases, really have to plead for institutional data to narrate our story is pathetic. That's the job of the universities to do that. Why should our early career researchers in precarious positions have to spend a huge amount of their time telling institutions what's wrong with how they're operating? There's people in very well-paid positions who get paid to do just that and don't do their job. So ngā mihi kia kōrua, Tara, kōrua ko Siriana, for the tremendous, you know, mahi that you're doing from your ngākau for Te Ao Māori and our Pacific whānau as well. It's just so incredibly important, and big mihi to you. Ngā mihi hui ki a koe whetu mō tō karakia hei whakapai tā tātou hui te ahi nei. Thank you to whetu for starting our meeting off in the right way. I'm not at Waikato at the moment. I'm down in Wellington because I have multiple pōtai, as do Tara and Siriana. And one of my pōtai, one of my hats that I'm wearing today is to support our tribal leaders in their data sovereignty mahi. So that's where I am. But it was wonderful that whetu could open this appropriately, given that it's been hosted on Waikato Whenua. So ngā mihi ki a koe whetu. And to Ian and Ash as well for opening spaces for challenging conversations. These are conversations that need to be had. But, you know, I feel like we've been having these bloody conversations for a long time. And what really needs to happen is action. And, you know, I was just reflecting, Tara, when you were saying that you were you had no Māori faculty, Siriana as well, or both of you, all of us actually, you know, go through our degrees. We don't have any wahine Māori in front of us. We don't see ourselves reflected in the curriculum. We don't see ourselves reflected in the lecturers and the faculty that teach. And I had that experience as well. I remember vividly when I rocked up to an Anthro 101 course, because I just did one of those kind of candy shop, I'll take every paper and every possible discipline that I can, except for statistics. And it's so ironic. I don't know how I ended up being a demographer. But I remember seeing Ngāpari Hopa as, you know, in front, commanding the lecture theatre. And she was the first Māori woman to gain a PhD at Oxford University. And she was the only Māori faculty in the whole of arts and social sciences when I started my degree at Waikato University in the mid-1990s. And, you know, the impact of seeing her there, because she was so commanding, you know, her pose and her prose and her intellect and her mātauranga Māori and her multiple ways of seeing the world, and the way she communicated this was just so invigorating. And she was able to do that in a way that nobody else was. And what's sad for me is, you know, I went overseas, did my PhD, came back, was really grateful and happy to get a job at Waikato University. But, you know, in the last 2 years, I've been on the promotions committee, not because people necessarily want me on the promotions committee, but because I was until very recently the only Māori professor in my faculty. So it's an abomination that fast forward 26 years from me sitting as an undergraduate, being blown away by a ngāpari hopa, that I should end up in the same position as the only Māori professor in a faculty of 19 professors. That's just completely unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Can I repeat myself again? It's unacceptable. So, you know, so when you asked Tara and Siriana, what do we need to do about that? There's been so many clear recommendations for change. It's not a mystery what's will, and it's a lack of action that maintains the status quo.
Yeah. Thanks, Tahu.
I'm sure you have some questions.
Jan and I are really glad to open these conversations, not only in front of the New Zealand audience, but also the Australian audience. And Jan has some interesting discussion point for our second korero. So I'm now handing over it to Jan to continue.
Okay.
Jan.
Thanks, Ash. So the person you've just heard from is my colleague, Professor Tahu Kukatai. I'll do the intro now, Tahu. Tahu's research specializes in Māori and Indigenous demographic research. She's involved in a huge amount of research projects, seriously, a huge amount, as well as being a member of the Chief Science Advisors Forum. There are two aspects of her work in particular that we're going to focus on today: her work on the science policy interface and her research into Indigenous data sovereignty. So thanks for joining us, Tahu. If we could start by briefly situating yourself in your kaupapa. To be honest, I know you've done that a little bit already with that brief intro, but I'll hand over to you for a moment if there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Oh yeah, look, I'll just keep it short. So he uri tēnei no Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Kino Haku, Te Ao Puri Huki. So I'm from my hapu and tribal affiliations are to Ngāti Tipa, which is where our rohe is where the Waikato River, which is the longest river in Aotearoa, meets the Tasman Sea. So that's homelands of Ngāti Tipa. That's where my tupuna, my ancestor Kukutai, lived. And when my grandfather was relatively young, we moved with a lot of our whānau from that rohe, from that territory, down to Tūranga Waiwai Marae to support Te Puia Herangi to build a place for us, by us, for us, as an expression of mana motuhake, as an expression of self-determination. And so that ethos runs strong in my blood and in my lived experience, I guess. So I suppose that's all of the situating I need to do. I've got 3 wonderful kids. I've got a wonderful husband from the far north. I've got a wonderful father who has somehow ended up doing a lot of research with me, and that's been just a joy. It's been a highlight. It's been a career highlight working with my dad. And I'm just so lucky that I get to do that and to work alongside my community as well. That's what I love doing, and I would love to have more time to do that instead of having to talk to a lot of institutions about how they should be doing things better. Okay,
kia ora Tahu. So within the Eventbrite link, there's a document entitled Te Tiriti-led Science Policy Approach for Aotearoa New Zealand, which you're lead author for. For those of you tuning in, I encourage you to click on it and open it already. It's a really, really important piece of work. I'd like to start with a quote from Professor Linda Turiwai-Smith that really stood out for me as just a way to introduce and position this work, which is very much focused on structural and systemic issues. She says, The globalization of knowledge and Western culture constantly reaffirms the West view of itself as the center of legitimate knowledge, the arbiter of what counts as knowledge and the source of what is civilized knowledge. So many individual fields have their own legacy of settler colonialism. To take my field of planning, it's become more widely understood that not only was it complicit in settler colonialism, but it legitimized it. It allocates development rights, it surveys, it zones land, and it was absolutely instrumental in the success of the settler colonial project, all while masquerading as this rational, objective, expert activity. And other fields have similar discussions, but the document really made me think of the bigger picture of science as an activity itself that's similarly complicit. It decides what's knowledge, who's expert, what's a problem, and so on. So perhaps we could start by you introducing to us some of the ways you think Western science and the science policy interface needs a rethink.
Oh, that's such a big question. And I suppose we did try to answer it in that report with some of the recommendations about things we thought, could change. But, at the heart of what sort of drove that report was my wonderful colleagues. So it was very much it was a co-production amongst a group of amazing Māori researchers who'd been, working across the RSNI sector for a very long time, who know the sector quite well, who know the structural challenges that we grapple with on a daily basis. Some had moved out of the sector and were like, this is sort of Momo time at this moment. It's a bit of a waste of time. I'm going to go and do it brings me joy, and that's working in communities with my people. And of course, there's other challenges there, particularly in terms of having access to sustainable funding, because government RSNI funding goes into particular channels, and there's no neat line into communities where a lot of our sort of expertise and knowledge base resides. So there's challenges in all those places. But what was wonderful about this report is we were able to kind of bring together for like a common purpose, a shared voice around what was fundamentally broken at that science policy interface. So a little different from the focus that Tara, Siriana and their team have been focusing very much on university institutions, and that's just such an important part of the broader RSNI sector. But the place where we were focusing on was very much that sort of science policy interface, partly because myself and Professor Tracy McIntosh from Tūhoi, who's amazing, who's been a mentor over the years, we're the only Māori on the Chief Science Advisor Forum, and kind of see up close what happens. And this is not to diminish the excellent advisors around the table, because this is not about individuals, this is about systems. What happens when what happens to the quality of advice and the knowledge systems that you can sort of draw on to formulate questions as well as responses when there's only one or two Māori around the table. What that really does to the sort of the quality of understanding and the approach. And so this report is partly, diagnostic about outlining fairly succinctly, because it's quite a short report. No one's going to read something that's too long, so we try to keep it quite short and accessible. What counts as knowledge? What counts as valid knowledge? Who counts as an expert? And really sort of challenging this model as sort of scientists as the experts, communities as the recipients of the expertise, and this kind of disconnection between knowledge, science, community and policymakers. I mean, it really doesn't make any sense in Te Ao Māori to make these sort of like very definitive boundaries, because as Māori, we've long been knowledge holders and policymakers, and knowledge and action are intertwined, and they're connected through whakapapa, through connection, genealogical connection, but other sorts of connections as well, and of course through our natural environment, not just interhuman relationships. So kind of extracting out knowledge and action as two separate things, and ignoring the capability and capacity within our communities, and thinking that knowledge only resides in institutions, just doesn't work for us. And we know that the system doesn't work for us, because look at the outcomes. One of the other things that came out of that report as well is that there's an incredible lack of transparency and accountability about how the large sum of money that's invested in RSNI each year must be over $1 billion, and that's meant to be contributing to kind of sustainable, inclusive growth and well-being of the nation, how does that translate into well-being for those who are most disadvantaged and to those to whom the government actually has treaty-related responsibilities and obligations? There's no, to go back to the work that Tara and Siriana have been doing is to use data to shine the light and to construct that narrative in an evidence-based way that's going to be listened to. When you start to sort of scrutinise this sort of amorphous RS&I sector and ask, well, how is that money actually benefiting Māori? It's actually pretty hard to come up with an answer to that. And then if you extend that and ask, well, how is that spend actually benefiting New Zealanders? There's actually still not a very clear answer to that. So there's lots of places in the system that can be improved, and I guess this report was about trying to put some pointers in the sand about where those improvements might happen.
Thanks, Tara. There's some recommendations in the report too. It made me feel about the conversations we've yet to have. How far away do you think we are? How open are those in power to acting on the recommendations?
Oh, well, in Wellington speak, people will say there's a high authorising environment now to act in ways that are consistent with being a treaty partner. We've got the Public Service Act, which of course there's te tiriti sort of obligations from the public service. We've got the Education and Training Act, which has te tiriti as well in there. So, there are some levers now that just didn't exist, 5 years ago. But, the words partnership can be used to sort of describe a number of arrangements. And I think while there's sort of a maturing of the sector in terms of understanding te tiriti as our cornerstone constitutional document and what that actually means to give meaningful effect to it, I think government agencies are quite comfortable with the notion of partnership, but it's partnership on their own terms. And often that will just be sort of tweaky around the edges, not fundamental sort of transformative change, which is what Te Ao Māori wants. But there really isn't, what hasn't been tested is really around Article 2, which is the rangatiratanga space, which is a self-determining, unapologetically Indigenous-led space. And that really is the space of radical transformation. That really is the space where we can sort of realise the substance, not the shadow, of our own sort of self-determined futures. But I don't think those in positions of power have been really tested yet about what that looks like, because it actually requires relinquishing power. So there's sort of an acceptance and a movement towards partnership. I would say still a very light touch on partnership, but that movement towards actually embracing mana motuhake, tino rangatiratanga, self-determination, that's still like that. But we had to surface that quite explicitly in the report. It didn't necessarily get a warm reception, that part of the report. Engari, haere tonu, there's an obligation to make that visible. In the same way that Tara, Siriana and their team have made it very visible in their collection of writing. And they aren't necessarily going to get thanked for that, have they, from the institutions themselves? Although in my view, the institutions should absolutely be thanking you because you've done a lot of the work for them.
Thanks, Tara. I'm just conscious of time, but I really want to cover the second bit of your work on Indigenous data sovereignty. I remember the first time I heard this topic being discussed and was struck by how obvious it was that there's not just sort of power in data, but power in its ownership, power in its storage, power in its purpose, the tags we attach, how searchable it is. And it was clear that, again, this is one of those discussions where we've got a long way to go. We've become a little familiar with it in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but I'm sure many of those listening might not be as familiar with it as we are. So perhaps we could start by just telling the story of how you became engaged with that area and what its key principles are.
Okay, I'll give you the short version, shall I? Because I'm mindful that we're 1:45 and people might have questions that they want to ask, and I keep talking and talking. Okay, so simply put, I guess Māori data sovereignty or Indigenous data sovereignty is about putting Indigenous data in Indigenous hands under Indigenous control for Indigenous wellbeing. So it's basically shifting the dial, putting Indigenous peoples in charge of their data. How you do that, there's a range of ways to do that. One of the things that sort of been focusing on lately is using the sort of the mechanism of data governance, but not data governance in a sort of a Western frame, but actually informed by tikanga Māori and mātauranga Māori. So bringing a set of values to it, which come from our own spaces rather than trying to sort of ad hoc bootstrap it onto an existing framework, which we know doesn't work. One of the reasons it doesn't work is because it's so individualistic and focused. And so, you know, a lot of the stuff around trust, data trust, consent, privacy, confidentiality, it's all built on a framework of personal data, autonomous individuals. And, you know, that's all fine and good. That's sort of necessary, but it's definitely not sufficient. So a lot of the sort of tikanga that we have in Te Ao Māori, which is around what knowledge should be transmitted, what knowledge should be shared, what knowledge should be protected, who should have access to it. This is all really around the collective. So it's not sort of like, you know, the individual is not the primary unit of analysis, to use demography speak. It's really the collective, and it's the collective that's absent in nearly all of the thinking around sort of data innovation, data privacy and data protection and so forth. So Indigenous data sovereignty sort of offers a very different way of thinking about data, how it gets collected, where it gets stored, who has access, how it gets governed, and who ultimately benefits from it.
Okay. Thank you, Tahu. I'm just conscious of time, and I know there might be a few questions coming in. So if you do have any questions, put them in the chat box, and we'll try and field them now. So Ash, I'm going to hand over to you to deal with any questions that are coming and distribute them around.
Yes. Thanks, Ian. We have some interesting questions that started to coming up. So we can start. We have one question from Irian Parkins. So Irian is a Pakeha PhD student, and the question here is, I am a Pakeha PhD student, and I'm curious, what are some ways I can make the university environment a safer space for my Maori and Pacifica colleague? Any thought on that?
Just listen to them and be the awkward person in the room asking the question so they don't have to, is kind of the short of it. Just listen and step up so that they don't have to take that emotional baggage of constantly fighting the good fight. I always appreciate it when someone else asks the question, or when someone else goes, hey, that's a bit racist. Or hey, that's a little bit, you're showing your bias, your unconscious bias. Maybe you didn't mean it that way. If you have to do it softly, do it softly. But it can mean a lot when someone else goes and sees the head of school and says, hey, this isn't okay. But also you're a PhD student, so the professors should be doing this, right? Or people like myself who have permanent employment, at least for now. My dad keeps reminding me I'm trying to get fired. Get the people who have permanent employment to take on these battles. Get your PhD done and support your colleagues to get their PhD done, and just ask your supervisors, ask your head of schools to fight it, because they're massively privileged beyond PhD students. Okay,
thank you, Seriana, Tara, and Tahu. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really appreciate you giving your time today. I know you're all in big demand. And also for sharing your kaupapa Māori, your knowledge in your work, and for setting the agenda, because the way that you're using these numbers is really has opened up some political space that has been closed for too long. Can we have a round of virtual applause from everyone, please? I have to imagine this. Really appreciate your time. And before we go, I'd also like to recognize the contribution of our outgoing ACRN chair, Professor Nicole Goran, who's worked so hard to develop ACRN and will be hugely missed. Our next event will be beamed live from Perth, Western Australia. More details soon on the ACRN Twitter feed, but I'm now going to hand over to Fetu, who's going to close our corridor.
Kia ora tātou katoa he kaupapa tira I kōrero ana I tēnei wā. Kia koutou ngā mana wahine e kōrero mai kia mātou, huri no ki te ao katoa, tēnā koutou. Yeah, I'll close our session now. Kia tau kia tātou katoa. Te ata whai o tō tātou ariki hukraiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, āmene. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Fatu. So thank you for registering, everyone. Harai, and I'll see you next time. And we will make the YouTube video online soon on the ACRN page. And thank you for tuning in. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.